Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Fringe Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you doing?
Well, I'm good, Nicholas. How are you?
I'm all right. Well, I'll get to that in a second. And I'm also joined by Chris Husson. Chris, how are you doing?
Doing well, thank you. Looking forward to first show of the week and what we get to talk about.
Indeed. Now, for those of you watching on YouTube, you will notice my camera is not on. And that is because apparently nothing in life can be simple, and my internet is down, much to my annoyance, and has been down for the whole weekend. But anyway, that's not your problem. That's my problem. Let's get into the news of today. And the first thing we're going to talk about is an interview with City Press this week, where Hermann Mashaba reflected on ActionSA's newest intentions in the coalition governments in Gauteng. Hermann Mashaba has announced that he intends, as part of ActionSA, to secure executive roles in the Johannesburg government, as well as he's also made inquiries about possibly in the Ekurhuleni government as well. This would bring the ActionSA into formal coalition, not just in Tshwane, where it holds the mayorship with the backing of the ANC and EFF, but it would now also participate in the executives of Johannesburg and possibly also Ekurhuleni as well. Although Mashaba noted that the ANC and Ekurhuleni has not responded to him yet. Mashaba said, quote, "I have said to the ANC up to the national leadership we are ready as ActionSA. If you guys are willing to give us executive positions in 2 metros, in Tshwane we have got the mayor, but we can help in others." He said about Johannesburg, "I know the people in the city, officials who can help the ANC turn the city around as long as they can stop their corruption. Johannesburg as a city in terms of its financial position is not as bad as Tshwane. So I said to them, let me work with you. But it's already 6 weeks. They keep saying, we'll come back to you. If you look at the ANC and then us in Johannesburg, we are the 3rd biggest party in the city of Johannesburg with 44 councillors, whereas the EFF has 29. If they give us positions, they must give us positions that can make an impact on the residents of Johannesburg." He said that originally we took a decision to work with them in Joburg and Ekurhuleni. We are only going to take the legislature, and Tshwane, they would assist us to take the speaker position. But he says that the nefarious machinations of the DA and its attempts to work with the ANC to sideline ActionSA forced him to change his opinion, and that he believed that the DA was when you co-govern with this is him speaking, when you co-govern with the DA, they govern with you like they've got a 2/3 majority. That arrogance in a coalition government will collapse government, and that's precisely what has happened. If you look at the collapse of coalitions throughout the country, the DA has been the culprit. After I took this decision not to work with the DA any longer, the ANC and EFF bloc couldn't form a government without ActionSA, and the DA bloc with the Freedom Front Plus couldn't form a government without ActionSA. I was left with no option but to form one with the ANC in Tshwane. Of course, this is quite a reversal from not too long ago when ActionSA originally announced its intentions to have a sort of supply and confidence agreement with the ANC in Johannesburg. This was before they took the mayorship of Tshwane, where ActionSA went at great lengths. I remember Michael Beaumont in a press conference saying, this is not a coalition with the ANC. You know, we're just holding them to account. We're doing this responsible thing. We're stabilizing government in the Gauteng metros. But it now seems that ActionSA is kind of fully willing to throw its lot in with the ANC. Now, look, I'm sure some will accuse me of being unfair to ActionSA, but I'm not really sure what the point of the party is right now. Let me explain. If you want a party that has in its policy documents a sort of non-racialism and that kind of thing, there's a bunch of parties around the country, notably the DA and also arguably the Freedom Front Plus and IFP to some degree have non-racialism in their policies. If you want an opposition party who doesn't really like the DA, there's also a lot of options. Everything from you've got like the UDM to Al Jamaha to various other types. If you want a larger party that does quite well in the Hattingh townships that opposes the ANC, you can go with that opposes the government but is also willing to work with them. You can go with the EFF. There's many options in the South African landscape. So one is left with the question of, what's the value proposition of ActionSA? Is it now Mashaba is great? If you think Mashaba is awesome, vote for ActionSA. Terence? What are your thoughts on this change in a policy by ActionSA?
It's complex and conflicted. I think, first of all, you're correct about the about ActionSA. Although I'd push back slightly, I would say that their kind of overall policy mix is, tends towards sort of social conservatism, economic liberalism, not that distinct from that of the DA, although I'd say on social issues probably more conservative. I think really their value proposition though is Hermann Mashaba. I think it's very much built around his personal brand, and I've said on this platform before that I do think that he has a kind of compelling life story that people can get behind. I know there's been some criticism of this, but there it is. Yeah, but I do think that there is something very mercurial about the way that they've behaved. I can understand their frustration and anger at the DA because the DA went and agreed to work with the ANC, but their proposition was then that they would step into this opposition role, which they seem to be trying to do in Parliament, but where they really have their mark, which is in the Gauteng local government sphere, they seem to have gone in the other direction. From stabilization to collaboration, coalition, and it seems that they're looking to deepen that. I think that it's going to be a difficult balancing act to present that to present and explain that to their constituents. I also struggle to see the benefit of doing so. There's not a great deal of time left before the next local government election. Dada Morewa even said, don't expect too much because the situation is dire. Is this perhaps because Hermann Mashaba sees a particular sense of mission around Johannesburg, having been the mayor here? I mean, I'm just spitballing here. I really don't know, but I think that the difficulty for them is that they're not going to be able to achieve a great deal, and I think that stepping into that role, I think it makes them co-responsible for what is not a great situation. So yeah, I wonder, and I wonder if this isn't perhaps being driven by a strain of emotionalism in their politics. But like you, I'm baffled.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big questions here is, even if you morally agree with Mashaba, you think that he's completely right about the DA, that he had to form a coalition government, and that he will be a positive influence in the coalition governments in Gauteng, in those municipalities. Strategically, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. As Terence said, there's not a lot of time to turn things around, especially when you have to make your voice heard above all the others within a coalition government. You have to prove that no, this thing that happened here was not because of the ANC or the EFF. It was because of us, the good thing that happened. And the Gauteng metros are all in crisis right now. So by going into government, at least if you're in the legislature, you can kind of try and create some sort of difference. You can say, well, look, we're just holding the executive to account. And I thought that was actually a relatively canny move in Joburg. But once you get into bed in the executive, you then suddenly can be co-blamed for everything. I'm sure the DA is rubbing their hands with glee at what they're going to campaign with in the next election, where I'm sure they're going to attack ActionSA as nothing but a collaborator who doesn't really fight for you when it takes up coalition positions. Chris, what do you think that's correct? Do you think that there's an upside for ActionSA here? Am I just not seeing it?
I think the biggest upside hinges on how effectively you can communicate how you've used the platforms and now role in coalitions in Tshwane and now possibly in Johannesburg that you've had for the last year leading into the next local government elections in 2026. So, I mean, we're pretty much in 2025 already. There are very few opportunities for you as a party to either shift voters' perceptions of you, to distinguish yourself from other parties, to really ensure that when people go and vote, when they come to your logo, or they go and look for your name and your logo when they go and vote. So, I mean, the great thing about our politics is that we're now in the era of coalition government, nationally and provincially. There are aspects of our system of representative democracy that meant it was always going to be like this. But in that context, for political parties that either in government or in opposition don't distinguish themselves in a positive sense, and in terms of motivating not their core base, but those who might be sitting on the fence, of whom there are many voters in South Africa. We have around 27 million registered voters. In this year's elections, I think only around between 10 and 11 million voted in any case. So are you now appealing to those in any way who didn't decide to vote this year? And just the last point to add, when you're in the opposition benches, you've now had the MK party and the EFF that have tried to style themselves as the Progressive Caucus. They're the official opposition in Parliament, in national politics. But you as ActionSA could have played a role in provincial politics and elements of national politics where you're a different kind of opposition, where you're on the rule of law, on free markets, on non-racialism, where you hold those parties who say they stand for those things in the GNU, you hold them to account on those terms because those are the things you believe in. You've built your party on those things. You've advocated for some of those things more so than others. And now there's a shift on basic values and principles. So yeah, it's going to require next level of capabilities in terms of communication, convincing, all of that sort of thing to convince those undecided voters. ActionSA's stock declined after the latest national and provincial elections, and I'm not sure whether there are enough opportunities now that you have the burden of governance, especially in Tshwane, that you can convince voters otherwise into the next local government elections.
So, Terence, go ahead.
Look, I just want to float an idea. I'm old enough to remember, as I often say, the 1990s, and Rolf Meyer, I think when he had set up, or when he was involved with the UDM, said that it was necessary for opposition parties to be in the ANC's slipstream. And I wonder whether the play here isn't to try and position the ActionSA as a type of social, if not political, bedfellow of the ANC, something that tends more towards the townships than the suburbs. I've noticed a lot of their rhetoric about the DA has been defaulting to almost ANC style narratives. The idea that these people don't understand apartheid, and there's an undercurrent of kind of race nationalism that comes up from time to time. Now I wonder whether this positioning isn't saying, well, we're on this side. It's a thought.
So, just on the question of Hermann Mashaba himself, I think he's a candidate who looks really great on sort of paper when you hear about his resume, his success in business, where he kind of comes from, the fact that he's, kind of committed, at least in writing, to sort of various free market ideas. But then when you actually kind of go and hear him, he's not as impressive. I was with him for a time in the Joburg City Council, so I got to meet him a couple of times and see him up close, and I must say I didn't come away with an impression of him as a grand political master of any kind. In fact, I think the shtick that he sort of discovered, which is this kind of in some ways more sort of liberal, in some ways more sort of conservative, in some ways occasionally being more non-racial, and then in other ways being sort of more race nationalist. It's actually a shtick, a sort of approach to the electorate. And Terence, I want your thoughts on this, that the Patriotic Alliance has since adopted, and that Gayton McKenzie has been far more successful at running with than Hermann Mashaba has actually been. And I suspect that the Patriotic Alliance is probably even though it comes from a sort of a different place, it's going to suck up all of the potential oxygen that could flow instead to ActionSA. What do you make of that as a theory?
I think there's something to be said for that. I think Gaten McKenzie is a more charismatic character than Hermann Mashaba. I think he's a lot more distinctive. He's a lot more, dare I say, Trumpian. And I mean this not in an ideological sense, but the ability to be transgressive. To I was on a TV talk show with him, and he was really in your face and harakat. And if nothing else, you came away remembering who he was. I think that as far as the kind of foreigner issue goes, he owns that far more than ActionSA. I think he's able to speak to a kind of disaffected population more directly. And also, I think to sort of balance the idea that yes, but he's also there for the population at large. I don't know. I call it canny political communication. I think he's been able to do that better than, certainly in my estimation, than ActionSA. So perhaps you're right.
I agree completely. All right, let's go on now to our next story, which is, and I'm sorry, we talked about this a lot recently, but I am rather enjoying it. The sort of continuing countdown of doom in the Führer bunker over at EFF headquarters, with Malema giving his speech to the EFF's elective conference, railing in no uncertain terms, although not naming him by name, very aggressively attacking Floyd Shivambu, whose departure from the EFF seems to have irked him, not just in a political sense, but also very deeply personally. At least that's the impression I get. Malema has railed against what he called the ideological infiltration and betrayal of the EFF, but the recent desertion of the party. And he said that these desertions are tantamount to a sort of metaphorical assassination attempt upon the ideological struggle of the EFF. So I'm going to just quote bits from his speech here. The EFF has most recently experienced most dangerous levels of infiltration. Because of this, infiltration has been perpetrated by founders of the movement who have been converted into sleeper agents and double agents who sat amongst us but reported elsewhere. The term infiltration is not a buzzword used to smear those who disagree with us, but it is a term that captures the best process of when one deliberately entrenches themselves in an organization for the purposes of sabotage, deceit, and betrayal. We are also confronted by an ideological infiltration and political degeneration. The ideological infiltration that confronts us is so sinister because it has the ability to utilize revolutionary language to justify compromise, betrayal, and collaboration. It is those who are most skilled among us in ideological language and rhetoric who have used the very same ideological tools of analysis to perpetuate and justify the betrayal of our people and values as an organization. A few high-ranking members resigned and began when certain individuals began to think of themselves as custodians of thinking in our movement. And unfortunately, we allowed it. The ideological infiltration of the EFF began when we allowed our struggle for liberation to be individualized. And it is that process that allowed ambition to thrive and ideological principles to die. He basically then admits there was some discussion when the government unity was being negotiated that Shivambu had sort of agreed with the ANC to some kind of outline of a deal, and then Malema went ahead and torpedoed the whole thing because he didn't want Shivambu to get the position, I think, of finance minister even was one of the suggestions here. Malema kind of validates some of those reporting claims here by saying the EFF was put under immense pressure by those who have left us behind to write petitions to the ANC and the GNU for inclusion in their compromised government, which is led by descendants of settler colonialists and white supremacists. We were persuaded to do so because there was a strong desire for positions at the expense of the principles of anti-racism and the return of the land. He then went on to say that the desertion of the EFF in this particular moment in our liberation struggle constitutes an assassination attempt. Fighters to lobby aggressively for a leftist, anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and socialist movement to co-govern with our oppressor over the lives of landless African peoples is infiltration. It is for this reason, delegates, that moving forward we must avoid individualism and promotion of people because it feeds into egos and leaves the organization vulnerable to infiltration. We are not going to sell future generations of our dreams for that of the dreams of an 82-year-old man who is corrupt to the core. Comrades, we are going to fight corruption during Zuma, even after Zuma. Zuma is corrupt. We are not misled about the corruption of Zuma. Well, Chris, it seems as though the short-lived love affair between the EFF and MK, I mean, from on issue to issue, it may continue because those two parties share a lot of ideological objectives. But it seems that the sort of broader feeling of good friendliness between them has completely collapsed, and that any functional sort of organization that we could call the Progressive Caucus no longer exists. Am I perhaps being a bit too sweeping with that analysis?
Well, it does help, maybe for purposes of placating one's opponents to look like you don't sing from the same hymn sheet. I don't think that's the case here, based on how this was delivered by Malema. So it would be one thing if this was just a press release, but you can, and throughout what's happened in the last few months after the elections, all the EFF presses, when Floyd Shivambu announced he was leaving, at all these opportunities, Malema, I think, very much wears his emotions on his sleeve. So, I mean, for the EFF, attained around, 9% in the elections, now polling around 6%, a continually downward trajectory. How are you distinguishing yourself, number one, from MK on the sort of revolutionary tag, but number two, just in terms of your organization and your capabilities, what you present to voters? So if voters decide to vote for you, do you present the image that you're still going to be around, or that you're just going to sort of, rail against things as they happen to you? So a sort of victim mentality. Now, on the other hand, you could argue building some kind of siege mentality helps those left in the party because the world is against you. Everyone's trying to overthrow us. We're the real revolutionaries. It's time to band together, all that sort of thing. But for someone with his trajectory, the star of Julius Malema, it's quite a harsh and very real come down.
Terence, your thoughts on Malema's pontification?
Well, look, I think that it's there's a lot of venom in what he said. I think there's a lot of emotion behind it, but I think it's interesting the way he's couched this in the sort of Marxist metaphysics, which I think is an indication that ideology still matters too much of our political cost. Is this the end? No, I don't think so. You see, I think that although the EFF has been very heavily personalized around Julius Malema, there was at least some effort to turn it into into an institutionalized entity in a way that MK hasn't. Now, I think many of the EFF people are peeling off because they see richer pickings in MK. I think that the fact that even its party president is still a member of the ANC and rejects their rejection of him, etc. There's something quite crazy about that. They probably see opportunities for themselves, whereas I think in the EFF it's been made clear that this is, for all of this going on about personalization, I think this is exactly what he's done. But I wonder whether the MK will survive the departure one way or another of Jacob Zuma, and I have my doubts. I think there'll be the mother of all squabbles over the carcass of that party. Malema, at least, probably has another 20, maybe 30 years of politics left. Potentially.
I think I do agree with that quite strongly, actually. I think the EFF may be diminished, and I think that it will still continue to exist as long as Malema's around. And as you say, we don't really know what the trajectory of the MK party is going forward. It's still the big unknown. But I do think that this has kind of probably, and politics can change a lot, So I'm not going to say that Malema will never be president, but there was a time when a lot of people would say to me in South Africa when they wanted to talk about politics, you know that Malema, one day he's going to be president.
He said it
And
himself.
Yes, no, he said it himself. And I think that the mystique has sort of been ripped from him. And I think part of that is that he's let his feelings get the better of him here, and it's clouding his strategic judgment. And I think that while the EFF may endure, I'm not sure whether it will inherit MK if MK collapses. In fact, there may even be a new sort of radical leftist party that springs up that we haven't seen yet. Chris, your final thoughts on this one? It's just, I think Malema's time as the sort of one of the biggest political figures on our stage is in some ways a bit past now.
Just to say, when a party declines so quickly, at least electorally, when individuals leave because maybe self-interest, or they just think their interests with certain allegations will also be better served being in the bigger party. For you as the leader and the leadership, if you consolidate things in the office of the presidency or the leader of the EFF, as has been the case with the EFF and Malema, and you don't then take on board the right sort of signals or the right feedback from those around you, then it just becomes a sort of echo chamber, and the decline, I think, feeds on itself. So I think that's partly what's at play here. And we now have, of course, the EFF's next elective conference, where neither MK nor ActionSA look to have elective conferences at any point. So we'll see how the EFF runs their next conference, who will be selected. I'm sure it'll just be a slate of individuals that Malema puts forward, and it'll be rubber stamped. But let's see how they run through these structures, these processes. It's very painful and difficult now, but if you're going to have any sort of future, then these sorts of things need to happen as a political party, and it might stand them in good stead. Let's see if you get the basics right.
Yeah, no, I mean, politics is a game that changes a lot. So I'm not going to say he will never be a great political figure again. But if I were betting money, I will say that he's probably not going to lead, even if the EFF endures, in part because of those things you're talking about, Chris, the sort of having structures and that sort of thing. Okay, let us go on to our last story, and this is from the little kingdom of Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland, on our borders. There's a story from the anti-corruption reporters Amubongane talking about how Eswatini, according to leaked documents from the Eswatini Financial Intelligence Unit, apparently Eswatini was being used as a conduit by which to potentially smuggle illegally obtained gold in Africa out to Dubai, where it would there sort of enter the global market for gold. The story is kind of interesting on of itself, but that's not really what we're going to talk about today too much. This is, I think, just a kind of interesting example of Swaziland's place, or Eswatini's place, in relation to South Africa, that it is sort of, Terence, strangely kind of insulated from a lot of the problems with its governance. It is an absolute monarchy where the king effectively has full control over the state. It's not a particularly well-run state. It could be run worse, I guess. It could be more totalitarian. It could be more dictatorial, but it's pretty dysfunctional generally. Some of the ANC's allies, like COSATU, have basically called for the overthrow of the monarchy in Swaziland, and they've supported the opposition there. The opposition in Swaziland has been cracked down on a number of times, and it continues to be very closely connected to South Africa. Quite a few Swazi people come here to work and send back remittances, that sort of thing. It also benefits a lot. A lot of its government budget comes from its share of the customs duties as part of, I think it's a SADC agreement that splits custom duties between Southern African countries. What do you make of Eswatini's placement with regards to South Africa? Why is it that the ANC, even though there's no particular ideological affinity with the Swazi king, has never really taken a strong line against them?
Well, just matter of correction, the customs union is SACU, Southern African Customs Union, which is the world's oldest section.
Yes,
yeah,
you're
and
correct,
that's I
sir.
think it's a majority of their budget. Look, I think that there's a couple of things. First of all, even during the apartheid era, it had a sort of funny place in that South African security agents had a certain access into what was in Swaziland. It wasn't considered a particularly safe place for ANC people to be. There was also quite a lot of economic activity that was offshored from South Africa into Swaziland because it wasn't subjected to sanctions, and some manufacturing was moved there. And I also understand that there's a kind of vassalage between the Swazi and the Zulu king, and there was a sense that if there had been an open civil war and KwaZulu had tried to break away in the early 90s, that they could have called on the support of the Swazi state to provide them with weapons. I mean, that was these some of the talking points. I think that the current round just comes down to the fact that post-colonial Africa has never been able to rid itself of the deference to sovereignty. Now, the African Union, after the Organization of African Unity was wound up and became the African Union, the idea was we went from non-interference to non-indifference. And yeah, technically you can be held to account, for abuses. I just don't think that anyone really took that seriously. And that is one thing that I do think the ANC has been fairly consistent on. It wouldn't, for various reasons, part of which was ideological affinity, it wouldn't tread on the Zimbabwean government's toes, and it very much has done the same thing with regard to Eswatini. Look, Eswatini could literally switch the lights off from South Africa. You cut the king out, but South Africa does not want to be the country that brought down another African country, and I think that's basically what there is to it.
Chris, any final thoughts before we close?
Just given everything that's going on at the moment with the latest G20 summit being concluded, and of course South Africa taking on the chairmanship of the G20 from the 1st of December, by the way, after which the US will be the next chairman, with President-elect Donald Trump taking up that position. Within that global context, and if South Africa wants to extend on these sorts of platforms some kind of influence and use the platforms to extend opportunities for investment and trade, you need to work in your immediate area to ensure that these sorts of things, not to intervene, as it were, but to use the tools and capacities and platforms that you have to ensure that sort of thing changes quite quickly, or at least is managed much better. I think those countries in the quote unquote global south, I know all three of us don't like that term. Let me rather talk about developing and emerging economies. Those that use what they have in terms of trade and investment better, and that work to stabilize their regions better, will benefit from shifting trade flows, shifting investment flows, as I think is going to be the case under President-elect Trump. So another example of where South Africa can act within its own region to ensure that it sets itself apart from other emerging markets.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. We hope you found the show interesting, and we will be back tomorrow with the Daily Friend Show. Can you feel it in the air? It's the slow approach of December. We are very close to the end of the year. Anyway, cheers everyone, and have a wonderful day.